Hey y'all, thanks for tuning into another of my Publisher Parish board game design diaries. I hope you're finding these interesting and enlightening about the board game design process or this game itself or whatever. Thanks for watching. Topic for today is grad school and how that functions in the game. In the real world of academia, most academic jobs as faculty require some sort of a graduate degree, often a terminal degree like a PhD, sometimes a master's. So, because of that, this was something that was important to me to include in a game about getting into academia and having a successful career there. And both for kind of educational purposes for people thinking about going that path, I wanted them to understand that you have to go through this grad school phase first. And also, just it was another step along the way in the game to get you to your final destination, what you're trying to achieve. Now, the challenge is grad school is hopefully relatively short. Hopefully, you're not in grad school for 15 or 20 years. So it's something you're dealing with for a few years of the game, but most of the rest of the time you're dealing with regular trying to get jobs, dealing with your family and stuff like that, and the grad school portion sort of passed after the beginning of the game. And so the challenge was to keep it simple enough that it wasn't kind of overwhelming or this whole other mechanic you had to learn to play in the game for these couple of years and then you never deal with again, while still maintaining some sense of like, yes, this is this separate phase that you go through, and it is a little different than having a regular teaching job or working at a university. To be blunt, that's been a challenge to make that work. I'll say on the very first playtest of the very first prototype of this game, I think the very first feedback I got was maybe you should get rid of the grad school part of this because it was kind of overly complicated and kind of kept you from getting into the rest of the game and all the other mechanics that work around getting jobs and progressing in your job and all that sort of thing. One of the challenges of being an artist I found as a filmmaker, but I think this applies to game design as well, is when you're working on a project, there's going to be a particular way you're envisioning it and all these things, how you would like it to be. And invariably, it's going to turn out that some of those don't go the way you planned for one reason or another. If it's film, often it's you couldn't afford it or couldn't get this location or didn't have the time to get this thing working the way you wanted. Or sometimes it's everything went the way you wanted and then you put it all together and something in the story just isn't working the way you planned. And you have to, in film, re-edit and change things and find a way to make the story work. And one thing I always tell my students is you have to be willing to let go of a lot of the details, but know what's the core of this to you. What is the core thing that the reason I made this film is because I want to say this or I wanted to get out this story or this emotion. And whatever else I have to change to make that work, okay, but I'm not letting go of that. And I'll say this is one of the things for filmmakers as they're starting out that's often really challenging is to be able to separate this is the core idea from all these details of how I wanted it and be willing to say like, no, your film is not about did I get this particular shot this way and it had this tree in the background this way, because a lot of times when people start out they'll have this exact vision of how they want things to be and anything that doesn't go like that is somehow a disaster. And it's like, no, what's the core thing you're trying to say? So why am I talking about that? This relates to the grad school thing because to me, I thought about it a lot because I did get some early suggestions about getting rid of grad school as part of the game. And to me, that was one of the core elements that I'm like, from a perspective of whatever educational or pedagogical value this may end up having in the end, that's kind of one of the hills that I'm willing to die on, is I feel like it's important that there's some aspect of going through grad school as part of the game. And you don't have to start out there. You can go work for a while and then go back to grad school. You can try to get a job without going to grad school, but having that somehow incorporated was one of those things I was not, for better or worse, willing to let go of. So then it came down to trying to figure out how do you make this work in the game to a point where it's not a burden, it's not overly complicated, but it's still doing what we want. So this was not a very first playtest, but somewhere along the way, an early playtest, kind of like what the grad school cards looked like. So very similarly to how you apply for jobs, there's different grad schools. So you can apply to grad school. You take a couple of these cards to kind of see, quote unquote, where you got into grad school, and you can choose one of those to do. And you'll notice there's just a lot of information on here. Again, this is before doing any design work or having any graphics or anything, but it's also just a lot to kind of take in and weigh. This is partly a design issue, and I'll show you when the design changed, how that looked different, but partly a mechanic construction issue. Yes, it was kind of hard to read through and get all this information correct because there's so much on there, but also there's just a lot to take in. And when somebody took 2 or 3 of these cars and they're trying to figure out which school they want to go to, even to kind of understand what to weigh or which of these would get them further along in the game faster was just really hard to tell because there was so much there. And that was a problem. So that's something that needed to be addressed. Here's an updated version of, I don't remember it's exactly that particular card, but of essentially a similar grad school card that had most of the same information on it, same kind of variation, but just once we gotten some icons created and tried to design it to be a little more legible. And I think this is a little more legible. You can see a little better instead of all this information, this giant grid and some very tiny print here and all these different questions. Kind of list things more simply, like here's your coursework. I can see that in these purple icons. If I have to do some teaching, I can see that with the orange apple icon here, and then I can see if there's some funding for me. Because one of the big questions for grad school is tuition is expensive. Do I want to pay $30,000 a year to go to this? Well, ideally, I'd like it if the school would help pay for that. And something different from undergrad, I know in undergrad there's a lot of scholarships and stuff available as well too, but in most grad programs there is some kind of funding. In fact, I had a smart advisor when I was an undergrad saying, don't go get a PhD if you have to pay for it, which is very good advice because you are never going to make that money back. Don't go into academia for the money. That's not where the money is. And so it's not something like med school or law school where you might go into debt to get that education, but with a reasonable hope of then getting a high-paying job, being able to pay it off. I'm not saying there aren't any high-paid academics, but in general, you shouldn't expect that going and getting a PhD is going to get you a very high-paying job that then you can pay off all the loans you took out to get that PhD. So most of the time, grad school has funding, and that's a lot of the stuff that was on these cards showing here, okay, you got a stipend of this amount, and they also covered your tuition. This is called a tuition waiver. Again, most grad schools have some kind of funding, particularly in PhD programs. You're usually getting some kind of tuition waiver and usually some stipend. Sometimes this is in the form of a fellowship, like this year here, where you're doing your coursework and they're paying you and waiving your tuition. Other years you might be doing some teaching to kind of earn that. Usually this would be in the form of a TA-ship, which depending on what type of school you're at, could be actually teaching your own classes. It could be, leading a discussion section or a lab while a professor is teaching the class, but you have some sort of teaching responsibilities. So I think this version is more legible, but it's still really complicated, still really a lot on there. This is one of those places where I had to think about what's the core thing that's important to me versus the details. And one of the details is in these early versions of the game, all of the schools had very different course structures, funding structures. Some might waive half of your tuition, but not the whole thing. The stipend amounts would vary. The teaching amounts would vary. At one school, you might have a TA-ship and you're teaching 1 class a year. Another school, you're teaching 3 classes. I was sort of, as in many of the early prototype things, trying to model more closely the variation you see in the actual world. That's great and all, but the amount of variation in the real world can be kind of overwhelming and wasn't really necessary to get the core element, that heart of the matter that I didn't want to let go of, which is that if you want to go into academia, you have to usually go through some sort of graduate program. So I said, okay, let's make all TA-ships the same. Let's make all the fellowships the same. Let's really simplify this down a lot because the funding structure, like how you were getting funding while you're in grad school, was one of the more complicated things, and get it to something simpler. So this is where I'm at right now. This is still something I'm actively working on, trying to figure out ways to simplify and make it work better, but here's a current version. I'll look down here in the PhD program for the funding. You can see instead of that giant grid of things, it's like year 1, you get this. Years 2 through 4, you get this. This is a fellowship. This is TA-ship. Year 5, you can roll to try to get a fellowship. And then what I've done is created tokens for a fellowship and a TA-ship, and you actually put those along your track on the board. So when you get to year 2, you're like, oh, I have a TA-ship this year. And it says on the token, because all the TA-ships are now the same, teach this much, and here's how much your salary is. It still lists the course load for each and says this is a 1-year program. Here you're in courses for 2 years, and then you have to do a dissertation. There's still, for my taste, too much text on here. This is one of the things I'm still working on simplifying. And part of this is another one of those things I may have to decide to let go of. But right now, I'm trying to keep a little bit of variation in that some schools have an MA that feeds into the PhD. So you kind of start in one and can start in the master's and go right into the PhD. Some schools, you have to already have your master's to get into the PhD program. Some schools will take you into a PhD program without a master's and you just skip the master's entirely. And then there's also master's programs where they don't have an affiliated PhD program. You just go there, you get your master's, and then you leave. Again, that's a variety that's in the real world. And I think there's some value to seeing that these different schools work in different ways, and that when you're applying for schools, you might think about what type of program is best for you to go into. That said, it might be something that it turns out for game purposes just isn't worth the added complexity, cost in terms of time and difficulty of handling that in the game versus just you go into a master's program or you go into a PhD program. We'll see. I actually am about to do some play tests with this latest version of these cards and kind of see how that works and if it's easier for people to process and if the system of the tokens for the fellowships and TA-ships works better. I still always want to look for ways to simplify and make things more legible, but then I'd feel more comfortable with it. If it's still problematic and people are still getting confused by it, then I might have to go back to the drawing board and simplify things even further. But I do want to keep this grad school element. So that's something that, again, to me is something that has to in some way remain in the game to keep it an accurate enough reflection of how academia works. That's the grad school portion of Publisher Parish. And also note the way the game starts out is you start out basically fresh out of college and you're already admitted to a couple of grad programs. So you start with access to a couple of these grad cards and can decide I want to go straight into grad school, or you can choose not to and go work in the world in a non-academic job for a while if you want to build up some savings or start a family or try to get into some different grad programs the following year because you don't like any of the ones that you had access to that first year. But that's kind of where you start out, and then there's mechanisms, along the way. If you want to go back to school because you haven't gone yet, or you did your master's and want to go back and get a PhD or whatever, you can do that kind of anywhere along the way in the game. But it's definitely a bigger factor in the game at the start. From what I've seen, watching playtests so far, most of the time, by the time we're 5-6 years in, everyone has kind of gone through grad school because they pretty quickly figure out that they don't have access to nearly as many job options if they haven't gotten at least their master's degree, and in most cases their PhD as well. So that's the grad school aspect of the game. Again, thanks for watching. Appreciate people tuning into these, and I'll see you next time.